It's almost 100 years since more than 13,000 Tasmanian men embarked on what they thought would be a great adventure, serving king and country in the First World War. Although it created the Anzac tradition, 2,500 Tasmanians were killed, many more were wounded. One who survived was the commanding officer of a Tasmanian battalion raised for that conflict. In an early centenary gift, the 12th 40th Battalion has been given an extensive collection of his medals and war diaries. In a war that killed 60,000 Australians, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Hazel Elliot was luckier than most. The commanding officer of the 12th Battalion, the Tasmanian, was wounded 3 times and survived.
In all of the times that he was wounded, to be back in command again about a month later is testament to his fortitude and is testament to his ability to lead, and I guess his commitment to his men and to his command.
Lieutenant Colonel David Hughes is the commanding officer of Tasmania's 12th 40th Battalion. He's recently taken possession of some of his predecessors' medals and diaries. Lieutenant Colonel Hughes says it's one of the most complete collections he's seen.
We haven't yet catalogued the entire collection. That's one of the things that we need to get on top of at the moment, so that we do have an exact record of what we have.
Charles Hazel Elliot was educated at Hobart's Friends School and then became a bank clerk. Like many gentlemen, he joined a militia unit, which were the equivalent of today's Army Reserves. At the outbreak of the First World War, he enlisted with the Australian Imperial Forces.
Like all soldiers, he went into Egypt, and it was in Egypt that he was promoted to Major, and from Egypt he and the rest of the battalion were at the first landings at Gallipoli.
The Anzacs were hit by a hail of fire as they stood crammed together in the boats.
It was a case of promotion by attrition, as the Major went from 3rd in command to 2nd, then Lieutenant Colonel, until he was wounded at Gallipoli.
But that wasn't the end of the war for Charles. He then continued to serve as the commander of the battalion on the Western Front and received a number of awards for his actions.
He was mentioned in dispatches on 3 occasions.
Mentioned in dispatches was a way of recognising a particular act of gallantry or a particular act of superior service.
His highest honour was to be made a Commander of the Order of St Michael and St George, which was effectively a personal gift from the King or Queen. He also received the Distinguished Service Order twice and the French Award for Military Merit.
It was quite unusual that soldiers would receive personal awards because of the level of expectation that was there. They had to be far in excess of doing their jobs and even doing their jobs well.
Talking to us via Skype from York in the United Kingdom, Chris Elliott speaks proudly of his grandfather's contribution.
I understand, that he had a really important part in preventing a German breakthrough, and the French were eternally grateful to him and his men for what they did.
The London Gazette at the time wrote that his actions on the Western Front turned what might have been a defeat into a victory.
That he took just a very few poorly trained cooks and backline people who weren't frontline troops and organised them and held the line until reinforcements could come. And the courage and bravery of that is amazing.
Elliot was wounded in the head in the battle, but again resumed command a month later. Almost 100 years on, the medals are in exceptional condition, but there are also diaries.
They detail what was happening at the time, and perhaps even more importantly, they detail what the commander was thinking, what he at the time thought was important.
And sometimes the less important, as some of his sketches reveal. The entry for November 11, 1918 is telling.
I'm not sure that any of us could really imagine what Armistice Day would have been like, but that he felt that it was important enough to tell us that he was having his tooth fixed as a result of that, and that Armistice Day basically meant that he could have a break.
18 months ago, my mother passed on to me a big box full of things, and I took them down to the Australia House in London. And before I did that, I had a look at some of the things in the box, and it was amazing to see my grandfather's Legion of Honour, which I'd never heard about. It had never been talked of.
Charles Elliot's grandson, Chris Elliot, lives in the United Kingdom and never met his grandfather, but he enjoyed a long relationship with his grandmother, also a Tasmanian.
She always talked about how she had been a nurse at the time of the First World War, and she had been in training before that, and that she had sailed on the first convoy of ships to Africa and then to Suez.
The collection handed to the 12th 40th includes her diaries, medals and other documents.
And if you look at the pages, you can see the courtship going on in 1913, and every so often in my grandmother's diary it says, went to see Chaz, had a nice day with Chaz, and very simple entries, but it records a growing friendship. And perhaps that explains why she and he both went off in the first wave of volunteers as the force to Gallipoli.
8th of August. Left Imbros for Anzac at breakfast time and took on deck cases and filled up with stretcher cases.
Alice King was also mentioned in dispatches. She was often very close to the front in casualty clearing stations.
Triage would have been one of the things that she'd have been involved in, so she would regularly have been making life and death decisions about the soldiers that were coming in there. She would have been one of those that was saying that soldier wasn't worth the effort in time and resources because of the severity of their wounds.
Charles arrived 3 days before the wedding. My wedding day. Married by Padre Richard in Melbourne Parish Church at 1 p.m.
After her marriage, Alice Elliot had to resign her position but continued to do voluntary work until she and her husband returned to Tasmania after the war. She was then active training nurses during World War II.
Both very active within the returned services community in Tasmania. She received an OBE, so she was made a member of the Order of the British Empire on the civil list quite late in sort of the 50s because of all of the work that she had done then as well.
Charles Elliot died in Hobart in 1956. Alice Elliot in 1977, and a ward at the Repatriation Hospital in Hobart is named in her honour. Lieutenant Colonel Hughes says it's important that what's been donated is kept together to display as a collection of Tasmanian history rather than simply military history.
It's too important to the history of Tasmania to keep this just to ourselves. And so obviously we're still taking advice from specialists about where this might best be curated. Personally, I'd like to see it in something like the Museum and Art Gallery.